Ukrainian intelligence has tried to buy off a pilot from the Russian Federation Army so that he would hand over one of the country's most valuable fighter jets, the MiG-31, and what's more, with the Kinzhal missile included. We know this story firsthand because the entire plot has been carefully dismantled by the Federal Security Service. And moreover, Russia has already issued the corresponding response to the Ukrainian side. Stay until the end, so I can tell you how those Kinzhal missiles actually ended up in the hands of the Ukrainian intelligence service, but not in the way you might imagine. Also, to find out firsthand what this operation really means and what it tells us about Ukraine's position, both politically and, of course, militarily, at the present time. I'm Liusivaya, war correspondent in Donbass and geopolitical analyst. Subscribe to this channel to stay up to date with the latest news, both international and military. Let's begin, as always, from the start. The Security Service of the Russian Federation, the Federal Security Service, has just dismantled a plot by the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Service, the main directorate of intelligence, which could have turned the entire international scene upside down, both geopolitically and militarily, of course. And the thing is, the main directorate of intelligence tried to bribe a pilot from the Russian Federation, from the Russian Federation Army, so that he would carry it out, a maneuver Ukraine ultimately executed in 2023. What they wanted was for the pilot of their choice to steal one of the Russian Federation Army's most prized aircraft, the Kaza MiG-31, which carries Kinzhal missiles. And they didn't just want the plane, but the plane with a gift included. At least one Kinzhal missile inside. And perhaps the most surprising part of all this lies in the conclusions, or in the final objective of the operation, which we will reveal indeed at the end of this video, because it might not actually be about Ukraine ending up receiving the plane itself. In this sense, the fact that it had that Kinzhal missile inside is absolutely key. The operation on Ukraine's part began to take shape back in October 2024. I mean, this was a long time ago. What happened is that instead of finding a pilot who actually wanted to sell himself to the Ukrainian army, and therefore to the West, because you'll see, since we're not just talking about Ukrainian intelligence services here, they found one who reported directly to the army, and therefore they ended up taking the matter to the Federal Security Service. So the ones who were actually chatting with the Ukrainian guru, with the Ukrainian secret agents, were the secret agents themselves, the secrets of the Russian Federation. In the end, they ended up outsmarting the first ones. Of course, those were Ukrainian agents. It should really be just a way of speaking, since the man who contacted the Russian pilot introduced himself as a journalist from Billingcat. This is something like an imaginary outlet that Ukrainian intelligence usually uses as a cover to contact all kinds of Russian military personnel and see if they end up buying any of them in
the darkness of August 24th, a telegram message came to me from the one I knew. The man had
a very clear Ukrainian accent, which, by the way, the pilot himself pointed out in one of the conversations they had on Telegram. Then, for that purpose, the Ukrainian side requested that different private chats be created, some on Telegram and others later on Signal. They even asked the pilot to send them photos to prove that he really had access to the aircraft. They wanted to see the number on the aircraft in question, to confirm that the Russian soldiers' intentions were indeed serious. To prove how serious they were, they sent videos showing bills everywhere, mountains and mountains of foreign currency.
They sent me photos and images.
The reward they promised was indeed quite juicy. For the plane itself, $1 million. And for the plane with the Kinzhal missile included, at least one, you understand, the full $3 million. In addition to that, the Russian pilot was offered the nationality of a third country, which, as understood, would be located somewhere. It's also especially significant because the Ukrainian intelligence service has already, in fact, carried out a similar operation, although with somewhat contradictory success.
That is to say,
A quick recap: the supposedly Western journalists, in this case British. Well, what a surprise, isn't it? Because the British Intelligence Service, Military Intelligence 6, does in fact have quite a lot to do with the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Service Main Directorate of Intelligence. We'll leave that question open. Anyway, journalists, supposedly British, spoke in perfect Ukrainian. They contacted this man to deal initially. After conducting little more than an interview, they later offered money for confidential army information. This could mean that they later wanted to use it to compromise the pilot and force him to take actions against, indeed, the army of the Russian Federation. And when the pilot refused to talk to them, handing the matter directly over to the Federal Security Service, that is, he properly informed his superiors. He flatly refused to sell himself for money and therefore to betray his homeland. The Federal Security Service agreed to all the requests. That's when things got interesting. Let's leave strictly military information, no matter how confidential it is, for another time. Do you have access to the aircraft of the Russian Federation? In that case, the plan will get very interesting for us. The most interesting thing about this matter is, without a doubt, the objectives of the operation. And the thing is, everything points to the fact that Ukraine didn't really have it planned. It is, as I said, especially important and essential. United Party, as announced by the E. During the Alaman period of Alaman in Portobrasov, all of this points to the fact that she was properly advised and may have even been helped by international intelligence services. Read especially, very especially the British. He was buried in the south of Spain on November 10th, 2024, after almost 7 months of not being able to lay his body to rest. The Ukrainian guru, in an operation that ended up being, at least for the Ukrainian side, actually quite successful, especially in media terms. He promised him, and it could even be that he ended up giving him $500,000 and citizenship from a third country. I imagine that in this case, we're talking especially about Spain, since until his last days, the person in question was living precisely in my second homeland, Spain, specifically in the La Cala neighborhood of the city of Villajoyosa, Alicante. It should be noted that we're very likely talking not only about a defector, but also about a murderer, because with him, there were 2 other Russian Federation Army soldiers flying in the military intelligence, 8 who were cold-bloodedly murdered. What isn't known is exactly by whom. Later, when he was already in Ukraine, he claimed that it was the Ukrainian side who killed them. But it could be, and in fact it's quite likely, that he had to do it himself, that he had to get rid of them himself, because otherwise, they simply wouldn't have allowed him to steal the helicopter, much less land it on Ukrainian territory. The fate he met, however, can be called anything but good, since sometime after his heroic feat, and after he had been living peacefully for a few months, although, according to the neighbors, he was known for drinking and using illegal substances. But after some time, I repeat, living in Spain, he ended up being murdered in cold blood by 2 strangers who shot him 6 times, one after another, and then ran him over with a car twice in a row. They haven't been found until now. The car they used to run him over was abandoned in a vacant lot, and then set on fire right after. In his conversation with the Russian Federal Security Service, the Ukrainian guru, Claro, is worth noting. Thinking they were talking to that pilot who could deliver them the crown jewel of the Federation Army, they arranged a meeting. What a huge surprise. Precisely to this pilot, Maxim Kuzminov. They even attached a photo of him, saying that only they could have that photo, and presenting the whole thing as a success story. You, relax, trust us. We've already taken care of this. Achieved with great results on more than one occasion. Great results, yes, but for the Ukrainian side, never for the defector pilot himself, Maxim Kuzminov. I imagine that this Russian pilot, whom they tried to contact, was facing a somewhat similar fate. The target itself is most remarkable. Unlike in the case of Kuzminov, when the Ukrainian side did keep the military intelligence, 8 from the Russian Federation, here, the possibility that the Mykoyan Gurevich, 31, would end up in the hands of the Ukrainian state was really small. Neither the possibility, nor perhaps the desire of Ukraine's own military intelligence. The most striking aspect is the target, and thus the chosen path. The pilot had to direct the aircraft toward one of the airfields in Odessa, but through the airspace. Romania, flying over the Black Sea and approaching one of NATO's largest important islands on Romanian territory, in the town of Constanța.
The MiG-31 aircraft was planned to be in the Black Sea Equator aircraft. In the assault plan, Alexander proposed that the assault be carried out at the airfield in Odessa Oblast through Romanian airspace. About the citizen of Constanța.
There, the coordinator of the entire operation, from the Ukrainian intelligence side, who called himself Alexander, told him that there was even a possibility that they might attack the aircraft or stage the attack for later. It's no longer clear whether to keep the plane, and therefore somehow also remove the pilot from the equation. That is, he would be offered the nationality of a third country. He would stay alive, of course. But this only happens in the stories told by the Ukrainian intelligence service. What would the reality be? Most likely quite different.
We relocate you, carry out a series of measures to create a cover story for you and your circle. Let's put it that way. We erase all traces and take steps to create a cover story for your disappearance. We can do something similar, like arrange for the plane to crash and so on. This will spread across media channels, after which our specialists will work with you and take necessary measures.
And in this regard, the Federal Security Service, that is, the Federal Security Service of Russia, has mentioned a much more dangerous target. The pilot was supposedly meant to fly to Odessa, but in reality, the goal was precisely to bring him closer to NATO airspace. Even bringing him into NATO airspace would cause a major international scandal. A plane from the Russian Federation with a Kinzhal missile inside, a hypersonic missile, no less, that would end up taking down NATO's air defense. Of course, this would make the whole world completely forget about the corruption that is now affecting the Kiev regime more than ever. On one hand, and on the other, about the defeats that the Ukrainian army is suffering one after another on the battlefield. What would happen to the pilot in this context? I imagine everyone is pretty clear about that, and that's considering the elimination of Maxim Kuzminov. Although, of course, it received countless theories blaming the Russian Federation and its intelligence services, it also has another rather curious outcome. Thus, the Ukrainian blogger Anatoly Shary once said that the pilot was actually eliminated by the Ukrainian intelligence service itself. Yes, the same intelligence service that organized the whole operation. With their involvement, they provided him with European documentation, as well as money, but to live peacefully, supposedly until the end of his days. What happened is that this ending came much sooner than the man in question expected. They didn't want to leave any loose ends. They simply couldn't let him live. That's what Anatoly Shary said. To what extent was he right or not? That remains to be seen. But what is clear is that this pilot could hardly have survived. And I'll go even further. He could hardly have survived even after leaving the Federation's airspace. The thing is, where the Ukrainian main Directorate of Intelligence launched the operation, supposedly seeking the greatest success, they were actually committing a real madness. They intended to provoke a real catastrophe, and now, for sure, to decisively and directly unleash World War III. Because what consequences could this act by Ukraine have had, if not for the fact that, thank God, it was prevented? On one hand, it's important to mention that some sources, including the Ukrainian blogger Sherry, are now saying that Zelensky himself is being investigated by the FBI itself. Meanwhile, things at the front couldn't be worse for Ukraine. The city of Pokrovsk is now practically controlled by the Russian Federation, and the same is happening in Mirnograd. The eastern part of Kupiansk is also under their control. You have to add Volchansk, and also the recent entry of Russia into Konstantinovsk, even the possibility of opening a new front in Chernihiv. I could go on like this for quite a while. Be that as it may, of course, I have also consulted this with my military sources here in Donbass, and they have described it as absolute madness. That is, they don't really understand whether the Ukrainian intelligence service didn't know that in Russia, this type of aircraft is monitored, basically, down to the last detail. No one would allow it to leave the airspace of the Federation just like that. This would require much more preparation than just a pilot. At one point, he even confessed to the Ukrainian side that he wouldn't know how to land the aircraft in question. Yes, I almost forgot that. Of course, they offered him to get rid of his teammates so they wouldn't be a bother. He said so, but I just can't do it without them. And they even put him in touch with a Ukrainian pilot so he could try to explain to him how to land a MiG-31. The final goal, though, most likely wasn't to land it. Or actually, it was simply not to land it at all. Never. I almost forgot the biggest bombshell. Are you here to find out the end of this story? Which has been tragic? Yes, but not for the Russian Federation's part, nor, thank God, for all of humanity. But still, a tremendous surprise for the Ukrainian side. Specifically for the organizers of this whole operation. It turns out that Russia did manage to get it to Ukraine, specifically to the Military Intelligence Service, to the Ukrainian main Directorate of Intelligence of that country. That Mikoyan Gurevich, 31 plane with the Kinzhals inside. However, instead of serving properly in the army, and therefore in the Ukrainian Air Force, the plane in question ended up attacking targets inside the country. So, on the night of November 9th to 10th, the Mikoyan Gurevich, 31 with Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, ended up directly attacking one of the main offices of the Ukrainian main Directorate of Intelligence. Specifically, the main office of radio-electronic intelligence was attacked, which is located in the town of Bribery, in the Kyiv region. And as a bonus, the Russian Federation has also ended up attacking the Starokostantinov airfield, where, surprise, surprise, the Western F-16s are located. So the million-dollar question in this regard would most likely be whether they think the pilots in Ukraine are really that incredibly stupid, the military of the Russian Federation, or if the real idiots here are actually on the Ukrainian side. Idiots are unpunished because Ukraine's actions, as we know very well, no matter how provocative they are, even if they constitute war crimes or state actions, are never condemned and sometimes not even mentioned by the Western side. If the blame, even though the act was committed by Ukraine, can be placed on the Russian Federation, is that exactly what the West will end up doing? Of course, spoiling a state like this, especially one that acts in this way, has consequences that can end up being absolutely terrible, so much so that they wouldn't be liked at all, not even in the West. The question, and therefore the possibility, in other words, the risk that the Kyiv regime, feeling absolutely immune to actions and reactions from the West, could end up literally doing anything